Okay, in order to save time, okay, let me read my draft of response. And first of all, I really like to thank Young-sun and Sojong and Doyle for organizing this book symposium. Okay, Theorizing Confucian Virtue Politics aims to provide a holistic account of Mencius and Xunzi's political thought by reconstructing their political ideas into coherent political theories in a way intelligible and interesting to contemporary readers, while paying close attention to the warring state circumstances in which Mencius and Xunzi found themselves. As a political theorist trained in political science, part of my motivation in writing this book was to initiate a vigorous philosophical conversation with the students of Chinese philosophy, narrowly defined in this case, to whom I owe tremendous intellectual debt by encouraging them to revisit Mencius and Xunzi's political thought in light of several novel theoretical frameworks that I constructed and see what new insights, if any, we can glean from this exercise. I'm not sure whether this book could and can offer something worth attention to Chinese philosophers. But my initial modest hope was that responses from the scholars versed in ancient Confucian texts, Chinese texts, philosophically as well as philologically, could help me further develop my theoretical frameworks and understanding of classical Confucianism. So the four commentaries presented in this symposium offer me the kinds of critical yet constructive engagement that I had hoped to receive from my colleagues in Chinese philosophy, and I'm deeply grateful to all commentators for their insights. So let me begin with Ellie and Young-sun together, because you guys are presenting interesting combination of critics in complementing way. In a commentary, Ellie's key question is whether it is plausible to see Mencius and Xunzi as having developed two distinct modes of Confucian virtue politics. Ellie's view is that it is an overstatement, that their differences are, in her words, so profound that one cannot treat them as a continuous whole. So Ellie accusing me as kind of dualist. Interestingly, Young-sun, Ellie's observation is markedly contrasted to Young-sun's observation, when Young-sun says, quote, Kim argues that Xunzi's possible Confucianism is a further articulation of the nascent insight in Mencius' thought, end of quote. So see, going back to Justin's original remark, you wrote a book, but then people interpret it quite differently, right? So it seems imperative to be clear from the get-go about where the purpose of this book lies. The argument that Mencius and Xunzi developed the distinct models of Confucian virtue politics is not incompatible with the view that there is a significant continuity between their political thought. In fact, one of my core arguments throughout this book is that much of Xunzi's political thought was seemingly motivated to re-articulate or address the questions with which Mencius struggled in a more systematic fashion. As ardent followers of Confucius, they both maneuvered within what I call the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics, and therefore it is only natural to find that they have much in common. Indeed, many contemporary scholars who understand Confucian ethics as virtue ethics, including P.J. Ivanhoe, Brian Van Noden, Dave Wong, many others, have forcefully claimed that as virtue ethicists, there is virtually no qualitative difference between Mencius and Xunzi as far as their visions of ideal man and politics are concerned. They're different and even contrasting account of human nature and the moral self-cultivation notwithstanding. In the book, however, I challenge this conventional view without taking issue with the continuity between ethics and politics in Confucianism by drawing attention to the significant differences in the way in which they envision the Confucian virtue politics with differing emphasis. It's very important. Differing emphasis between virtue and ritual institutions, between moral virtue and civic virtue, and between positive and negative dimensions of Confucian politics. Put differently, the central premise of this book is that there is an important connection between Mencius and Xunzi's contrasting accounts of human nature and their visions of politics, despite their shared commitment to the kingly way. Ellie raised several specific questions. First, she finds my understanding of Mencius in relation to possible Confucianism unsatisfying and even puzzling because, in her view, Mencius has a more robust argument to make in favor of positive Confucianism. According to Ellie, my interpretation of Mencius in his dialogue with the King Xuan of Qi regarding Snow Palace in Mencius 4, which highlights the extension of rulers' private interest to the people, lacks textual support. Instead, she claims that, quote, what Mencius does is more like correcting or redirecting the ruler's way of thinking so he can see how he may really get what he wants, end of quote. In other words, on Ellie's interpretation, the gist of Mencius' instruction to King Shun is that in order to secure his private interest, which is becoming the ruler of the whole kingdom, whole world, the king must practice benevolent government, good government, predicated on Ren and E. The problem with the Ellie, as I say, the problem with the Ellie's alternative interpretation is that it allows no space for what I call public interest, which I argue in the book is central to Mencius as well as Xunzi's idea of positive Confucianism. What Ellie points to here is the possibility of an ad hoc or prudential congruence between the ruler's private interest and the benevolent public policy in Mencius' political thought. Okay, ruler's private interest and benevolent public policy. Unlike Mencius, however, Xunziye has a compelling explanation for how the public good arises from the rulers and the common people's prudential motivation to put themselves under ritual institutional constraints. So I'm distinguishing public policy, good public policy, and public institutions here. And this shifts Xunziye's attention from his private interest, narrowly, the ruler's attention from his private interest, narrowly understood, to the Confucian public, specifically the preservation of ritual-based public order and the promotion of well-being of the people. Xunziye makes a coherent argument regarding the formation of a public good precisely because he starts with the assumption that human nature is bad. Ellie's alternative interpretation focused on correct thinking does not seem to help us understand clearly the formation of a durable public interest and its political significance in Mencius' political thought, without which the practice of a positive Confucianism can hardly sustain itself. In contrast, my argument focusing on the extension of rulers' private interest into the public interest shows, in a way consistent with the Mencius' moral psychology of extension, that Mencius had a seminal idea of a positive Confucianism, and that Mencius' positive Confucianism, concentrated on good public policy, does not go as far as to concern itself with the rise and, more importantly, sustenance of the public institutions that both the ruler and the people have prudential reasons to subscribe to. This institutional or constitutionalist understanding of a possible Confucianism can also explain why Badao, the hegemonic rule, was embraced by Xunziye as a specific version of a possible Confucianism rather than as the polar opposite to Confucian virtue politics. So my focus is on the institutional dimension of the public rather than good public policy. Any benevolent ruler can practice good benevolent policy, but what I'm focusing on is like enduring the formation and sustenance of enduring public institutions that contribute to public good. Here, however, Yongsun noticed an asymmetry. In other words, that is, while for Mencius it is the ruler's transformed interest or enlightened interest that legitimately enables the ruler, it is rather the ruler's true or raw interest that does the same job for Xunziye. Okay, but I must say this is precisely the point. From Xunziye's standpoint, Mencius' preoccupation with the transformed interest does not properly account for the ruler's interest in ritual institutions, not merely his good public policy, for the formation of the enduring public interest that can benefit both himself and the people in the long run. In Xunziye's view, Mencius rightly pays attention to self-interest, yes, but his theory, Mencius' theory of human nature, focused on nascent moral sentiments, and his argument for the restraint of desire, Zhiryu, have very little to offer in explaining or generating the institutionalized public good that is conducive to public order. For Xunziye, the long-term public good is possible only if ritual institutions are embraced by both the ruler and the ruled, and the voluntary embrace of ritual institutions is inconceivable without positing their nature as bad or self-interest. Here, Yongsun sees a asymmetry, but I rather see here an important theoretical improvement. In this connection, Ellie's second objection to what she deems to be my stark distinction between Xunziye and Mencius is still worth noting. Ellie rightly notes then Mencius too cherishes the value of ritual institutions or ritual practices like Sanyuli, and the Minghol examples. And in his political thought, rituals also play pivotal political roles in at once constraining and enabling the ruler. Again, I do not deny the significance of rituals in Mencius' political thought. In fact, no classical Confucians dismiss the moral and political importance of rituals in actualizing good government. What we do not see in Mencius, who places an immense normative emphasis on the charismatic authority of the Confucian ministers vis-a-vis the ruler, is the specific political structures that institutionally undergird the good government, whose preservation requires a specific set of virtues, what I call civic virtue. So I don't see that clearly in Mencius' political thought. As I said repeatedly in the book, I do not attribute a stark normative separation between moral virtue and civic virtue to Xunziye. However, it seems to me undeniable that the way Xunziye constructs the institutional scaffolding of Confucian virtue politics renders civic virtues far more salient in his political theory than in Mencius' theory, in which so-called preservative virtues underscoring the ritual institutions are never presented as first virtue, again in Mencius. It is unclear that Ellie shares my conceptualization of civic virtue, but she believes that in his emphasis on moral education, Mencius also acknowledges the virtues that, quote, relate more directly to an ordinary life, end of quote, than those necessary for achieving sagehood. So Ellie attributes this type of civic virtues to Mencius as well, right, in ordinary life. The difference between Ellie and me is that while Ellie sees the relation between moral virtue and civic virtue in terms of a seamless continuum, I accentuate, stress the letters, the civic virtues more distinctively civic political nature, as clearly evidenced in my discussion of the political virtue of moderation in chapter 5 of the book. So it is precisely for this very overtly political nature of civic virtue that Youngsun now finds it troubling. However, in Youngsun's view, it would be better to understand the differences, if any, between moral virtue and civic virtue on a spectrum, rendering civic virtue as, quote, the minimum function of a virtue to prevent disorder, and moral virtue as the maximum function of virtue to contribute to human excellence and flourishing, end of quote. I agree that the spectrum account of Confucian virtue Youngsun develops here can effectively account for Mencius' rudimentary acknowledgement of the distinction between moral virtues and civic-like qualities. This is a Lubna Elavin's term, and I think Ellie would agree with this. That being said, I find Youngsun's next move a little bit puzzling, because Youngsun argues in reference to virtue of trustworthiness demonstrated by Duke Huan of Qi, which I presented in the book as a political virtue. And Youngsun argues that, quote, it is not that there are two types of trustworthiness. It is just that the virtue of trustworthiness can be practiced in different domains and producing corresponding effects, end of quote. Here, though, the key question is what effect we can expect from the political domain when a political actor, typically a ruler in the Confucian context, makes a tough decision with a view to the public good. The virtue of trustworthiness demonstrated by Duke Huan, who is far from morally cultivated, according to Xunziye and Mencius and Confucius as well, toward Guanzhong, his former enemy, is hardly a moral virtue, developmentally extended from moral self-cultivation to the domain of politics. It is a political virtue, precisely in the sense of being a character trait called upon under particular political circumstances in order to bring about good political results. Still, in valorizing Duke Huan's political virtue of trustworthiness, at the heart of which lies the virtue of moderation or subduing one's private feelings, Xunziye does not suggest a stark separation between ethics and politics. What he seems to question is a straightforwardly linear or spectrum-like continuity between human moral virtue and civic political virtue as presupposed in Mencian Confucianism. It is for this reason that I capture Xunziye's theory of virtue in terms of a tempered virtue monism, attributing to Mencius strong virtue monism. Tempered virtue monism creates within the perimeter of Confucian virtue ethics, politics, space for political agency marked by a more pronounced interest in good public political outcomes, such as political order and stability. In tempered virtue monism, virtue becomes more directly concerned with the political goods, which Confucianism takes to be instrumentally valuable for people's moral self-cultivation. While moral human virtue is concerned with one's human excellence or human flourishing, and thus it is intrinsically motivated by the profound inner joy, pleasure resulting from its practice. As Mencius forcibly argues, civic political virtue's connection with the moral perfection or sagehood is far from straightforward or arguably tangential. No political actor is expected to cultivate civic political virtue for its own sake, or because it's joyable, right? Duko Wahan developed this political virtue because it's joyable, or it's pleasurable. It doesn't make any sense to me. Yongsan's alternative spectrum view of Confucian virtue is limited in properly addressing this difference between Xunziye and Mencius. So let me turn to Justin and by implication Ellie and Yongsan again. While Yongsan and Ellie attempt an internal critique of my core attempt and a core argument in philosophical interpretation, Justin tries to show ways to improve my argument on my grounds, although this does not mean he fully agrees to my theoretical frameworks. Justin pays special attention to my attribution constitutionalism to Mencius and Xunziye's political thought. I must confess that it took me some intellectual audacity to describe Mencius and Xunziye's political theories in terms of constitutionalism, given the ongoing controversy among political philosophers and legal scholars as well. In the book, I understood constitutionalism in terms of a moral political commitment to the government, at once enabled and constrained by moral and institutional norms that are geared toward the public good, particularly the well-being of the people. As Justin rightly notes, I do not go as far as to say that Mencius and Xunziye were robust constitutionalists with developed ideas and constitutional remedies such as constitutional rights and judicial review. Justin agrees that we may understand Mencius and Xunziye as attenuated constitutionalists who employ virtue and ritual as some sort of constitutional constraint. Then he raised two questions: whether it is reasonable to call Xunziye a ritual constitutionalist, and whether we can make the classical case for Confucian constitutionalism more robust by finding some textual evidence for constitutional remedies from the Mencius and the Xunziye. Okay, regarding the first question, Justin draws attention to opening lines of Book 12, Jundao, of the Xunziye, where Justin read it, right? There are laws that create chaos. There are no states that create chaos, and so on, right? Actually, I kind of anticipated this criticism, and I wrote in my book that quote, it's from my book: after establishing institutional and character-based theories as two dominant models of Confucian political theory, Justin and Stephen Engel in their book New Confucianism, a Neo-Confucianism of Philosophical Interpretation, published in 2017, singled out Xunziye as a paragon of a character-based theory by drawing on Xunziye 12.1, right? And related passages. I do not deny, I continue to say in my book, that Xunziye, just like any Confucian, would as far as one subscribes to paradigm of Confucian virtue politics, emphasizes the pivotal emphasis of the ruler's moral character and virtue. But I think that his ultimate concern lies with the rules and regulations that bring about and maintain order, end of quote. This is from my book. So Justin wonders, as anticipated, why I call Xunziye a ritual constitutionalist despite Xunziye's emphasis of the pivotal importance of ruler's moral character and virtue, and my explicit acknowledgement of this fact, right? So as noted earlier and throughout the book, I claim that Mencius and Xunziye maneuver within the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics, which has four stipulations regarding virtue politics, moral education, and material well-being. So, as far as my theoretical frameworks are concerned, the fact that Xunziye stressed the foundational importance of the ruler's virtue or moral character is not inconsistent with me calling him a ritual constitutionalist who is placed within the paradigm of Confucian virtue politics. A more pressing question here, then, seems to be how Xunzi's vision of Confucian virtue politics is distinguished from its Mencian counterpart, despite the fact that both cherish virtue and ritual in enacting Confucian constitutionalism. I have 2 points to make. First, it is important to note how Xunzi defines the ruler, Jun. According to Xunzi, let me quote, one who used ritual and yi to employ his subordinates is called a proper ruler, Jun. The true ruler, true lord, is one who is good at forming community, end of quote. And elsewhere he also says, quote, in order for true ruler, in order for people to live, they cannot be without community. If they form communities but lack social divisions, then they will struggle with each other. And then finally, therefore, the lord of man is the pivot and crucial point in controlling social divisions. Thus, to ordain them, the rulers, is to ordain the root of the whole world. To honor them, the rulers, is to honor the root of the whole world, end of quote. Undoubtedly, it would be better, or much better, if the ruler possessed a formidable moral character that can enable him to continue to stay on the right track of government, good government, against all sorts of situational variations. And I surmise that this is Mencius' point as a virtue constitutionalist. In the quoted paragraphs in which Xunzi offers a formal definition of the ruler. He doesn't describe good character of Yao Shun, but he offers a very formal definition of ruler. However, Xunzi's eminent concern seems to me lie not so much in the virtues, like moral virtues, more precise, such as ran, yi, li, zhi, which for Mencius works as engines of a good government, but rather in the institutional political roles that the office of a kingship plays in forming community by controlling social divisions, thereby coping with the problems of social coordination. So it's not just a character of ruler as such, but it's an office of rulership. It is certainly not the case that Mencius pays no attention to the problem of social coordination, as demonstrated by Lubna Lamin and several others. But it is undeniable that Mencius rarely, almost never, approaches the ruler in terms of the office he occupies, which makes him anyone who has ascended the throne by his hereditary right rather than by virtue, ruler, right? Anyone ruler by means of hereditary right, and the political functions affiliated with it, the office of rulership. This institutional interpretation of Xunzi's account of ruler is consistent with his rejection of the abdication doctrine and his support for hereditary kingship. Moreover, my institutional interpretation can also offer a coherent account of Xunzi's acknowledgement of a hegemonic rule as one specific mode of positive Confucianism. For Xunzi, the hegemonic rule is an acceptable mode of Confucian statecraft because it relies on the ruler's institutional ability to form community by means of social divisions. They don't have to be predicated on yi, but still there are divisions in Xunzi's hegemonic rulership. Although this ruler lacks ren and yi. Justin's virtue or character standard interpretation of Xunzi makes it, I think, difficult to come to grips with the Xunzi's careful distinction between the kingly way and hegemonic rule within the perimeter of Confucian virtue politics. As far as Justin's second question goes, which concerns the possible constitutional remedies in Mencius and Xunzi, I have actually little to say because I completely agree with him. I agree that while we may be able to derive some useful insights from Mencius' discussion of rebellion and regicide on constitutional remedies, his avowed commitment to due process, giving more moral privileges to aristocrats than lay people, would make it extremely difficult to justify entrenched constitutional remedies such as equal constitutional rights or popular sovereignty. The only disagreement between me and Justin on this second question seems to have to do with the normative status of people in Xunzi's political thought. The question also raised by Youngson. At the core of Justin's criticism is that I have mistaken what is essentially a descriptive account of the people for Xunzi's political thought, for Xunzi's normative elevation of the people, right? But I'm still struggling, actually. That might be true, but I'm still struggling how to understand the moral state of people in Xunzi's political thought in a way consistent with his prudential argument for the formation of a Confucian regime, because he extremely pays close attention to people, right? How bad the people, voluntarily bring themselves to the ritual order, right? People. The critical absence of attention to mandate of heaven and heaven's delegated officer, as a rightful political agent during the constitutional crisis in Sunji theory. And most important, his quasi-contractual understanding of the relation between ruler and the people. This is the term I borrowed from rates, Heine rates. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure how can we render Sunji's idea of people in a way consistent with his other arguments in his political thought. So as Youngson encourages, there is much to think about this important question, and it will surely remain as one of my key research questions in the future. Finally, I turn to Roger. So Roger Ames is one of the most distinguished scholars in Chinese philosophy, and there would be no one in the field who has not benefited from his translations of Chinese classics, philosophical interpretations, and ethical and political writings. I'm one of them. Roger's commentary powerfully sums up what it takes to be the most authentic way to study Confucian philosophy by being respectful to of its holistic and organic and ecological worldview, and being faithful to its understanding of persons as human becomings rather than human beings. Unlike other commentators, Roger provides an external critic by taking issue with the very foundation of my entire argument, the assumption that Confucianism is a sort of a virtue ethics. In Roger's view, the theoretical frameworks that I constructed for heuristic purposes show that there is a kind of a residual dualism in my approach, and then I'll skip some of his argument. So in his view, this is wrong because it goes against what he calls the zoology, right? As opposed to Western ontology of Confucian philosophy and Confucian role ethics, a mode of ethics that captures human existence and relations and interactions from the perspective of becoming. It goes beyond the scope of this short comment response to fully delve into the nature of Confucian ethics, which is one of the most controversial topics in contemporary Chinese philosophy. In fact, in the book, I do not actually touch upon the nature of Confucianism as such, nor its cosmology or anti-ontology. As its book title shows, the guiding purpose of Theorizing Confucian virtue politics is to reconstruct Confucian, Mencius, and Xunzi's otherwise scattered political ideas into coherent and intelligible political theories that can be discussed, challenged, and revised, and hopefully improved. That's my purpose. So I don't mind being challenged or even refuted. Okay, I honestly do not know whether it is indeed to commit a fallacy of reinforcing Western ontological distinctions between substance and extent, between essence and its contingent attribute, if I understand Chinese character Ren, human being, Ren, as human beings rather than human becomings. I'm not sure whether if we render Ren as human beings, then we're gonna reintroduce Western categories on or impose Western rationalist categories in Chinese philosophy. Honestly, I'm not sure, but I look forward to hearing more from Roger's view on this. But then I have several substantive questions or keywords, and then that I want us to continue to discuss. Since Roger's commentary focused on general feature of Chinese Confucian philosophy without directly engaging with my specific arguments about Mencius and Xunzi, I wonder whether it is his view, your view, rather, that there is no meaningful difference between Mencius and Xunzi in their political ideas and orientations. In emphasizing, in Roger's words, the already eventful nature of human becomings and the unsummed totality, is Roger contending that it is philosophically unimportant that Xunzi disagree with the Mencius on human nature, the method of modus after cultivation, and the doctrine of application, or the origin of ritual, and the role of the hegemon in the interstate relations? These are the questions political scientists and political theorists are extremely concerned with, but I'm curious what Roger would say about these important distinctions, the disagreements between Mencius and Xunzi, because in his commentary, he doesn't engage with these kind of questions that were very important to me. So there are other things, but then I will skip. Okay. Even if what Roger has in mind is that we can theorize Confucian canons only as a intrinsic feature of practical activity, not theorization for its own sake, which I completely agree with you, Roger. I still wonder precisely how Theorizing Confucian, my book, deviates from this Confucian wisdom. As I make clear in introduction, part of the motivation in writing this book came from my desire to provide a reliable, if not the authoritative, but reliable common reference for contemporary Confucian political theory, given the fact that virtually all contemporary Confucian political philosophers draw their normative or political inspirations from classical Confucianism, but they interpret classical texts very differently. So my modest was to kind of offer kind of a reliable, if not, again, the most authoritative reference so that we can have a more meaningful and a focused conversation, especially when we developing normative and political contemporary Confucian political theory. If what Roger intends to convey here is that an analytical investigation of important philosophical and political questions is fundamentally at odds with any contemporary Confucian philosophical writings, then it strikes me a little bit puzzling as an analytic investigation and philosophical theorization were the very intellectual locomotives that drove philosophical development during Song Dynasty and Joseon Dynasty. It is difficult to understand how the way I engage the way the text of Mencius and Xunziye goes against the Wittgensteinian dictum that, quote, theoretical tools arise for philosophers in this tradition in medias res, that is, from the need to make practice more productive and intelligible within the context of the practice themselves. Certainly, it was the need to make a practice more productive and intelligent that motivated me to philosophically reconstruct Mencius and Xunziye philosophical thought and present their philosophical, practical political visions in terms of two competing theories within the perimeter of Confucian virtue politics, which is itself practice-oriented, most importantly, with the promotion of the well-being of the people. So lastly, I know I'm running short of time or over time, but I deeply appreciate Roger's acknowledgement of my non-exclusive yet functional contrast between Mencius' virtue constitutionalism and Xunziye's ritual constitutionalism. But note that all dyadic frameworks employed in the book, including the distinction between moral virtue and civic virtue, to which Roger paid special attention, are likewise non-exclusive and functional contrast. I took pains to emphasize this fact that I'm not subscribed to any kind of dichotomy, because these dyads are developed for heuristic purpose in order to highlight more pronounced dimension of each thinker's ideas. Roger welcomes my framing of classical Confucianism with reference to constitutionalism because it would be useful in counterbalancing the still persistent Hegelian caricature of Confucian China as an Oriental despotism. Then, interestingly, Roger presents his own vision of Confucian constitutionalism from the perspective of Confucian role ethics by stressing the Confucian assumption of an isomorphism between family and state, which results in, quote, a collateral, albeit asymmetrical, effecting of social and political order through promoting a self-ordered society, end of quote. But apparently, Roger's philosophical idea of Confucian constitutionalism is inspired by analects, and as he quoted in his own presentation, where Confucius famously contrasts rule by virtue and ritual to rule by administrative injunctions and penal code. I have no objection to this Roger's own philosophical vision of Confucian constitutionalism, and I would like to hear more about it, especially how such a role-based Confucian constitution can address the issues of constitutional constraint and constitutional remedies and constitutional empowerment, as Justin pressed me, and now you, Roger, as well, to clarify. What I'm still not sure is how this vision of role ethical Confucian constitutionalism presents either Mencius or Xunziye's political thought, or whether in offering his own alternative vision of Confucian constitutionalism, which valorizes a spontaneous social political order, Roger finds fault with my account of Mencius or Xunziye's contrasting visions of Confucian constitutionalism. I'm not a little bit sure how you understand my interpretation of Mencius and Xunziye in this regard, although I clearly understand where you're coming from. In conclusion, I'm very pleased to end this conversation with my commentaries with the idea of Confucian constitutionalism, because my current book project, which will take a couple of years, is on Confucian constitutionalism in the contemporary pluralist East Asian context. All commentaries have helped me think deeply and critically about the constitutional dimension of Confucianism, and it will further encourage me to better articulate the constitutional possibility of Confucianism for contemporary East Asian societies. For this inspiration, I'm immeasurably grateful for all of your comments, Christian. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sungmoon.